The moment Gabriel Major's eyes landed on her, the room seemed to contract. Air thickened, sound dulled, and every other presence faded into irrelevance. He didn't move, he simply observed, and the effect was undeniable. It wasn't her dress, her walk, or the effortless grace of her stance, it was the magnetism, the quiet force that seemed to radiate from her every inch, daring him to cross boundaries he had never crossed before. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Mariam Duke was equally aware of the gravity of the moment. She didn't just enter a space, she dominated it, not with arrogance but with an elegance that spoke of power and precision. Every subtle movement was a declaration, a shoulder shift, a slow turn of her head, a barely perceptible glance that carried intent. And Gabriel felt it in his chest, the taut pull of tension, the unmistakable spark that crackled the second their eyes met. This was not flirtation. Not play. Not idle curiosity. It was something heavier, something sharp and compelling, measured in inches and seconds. Every step they took, every micro-adjustment in posture, was a silent negotiation of desire. His presence brushed against hers like a current of electricity, dangerous, demanding, inescapable. She reciprocated in kind, matching his intensity, letting him feel the friction without offering surrender. There was a subtle orchestration to the space around them. Nothing was loud or ostentatious, yet everything spoke of wealth, of control, of exacting taste. Gabriel noticed it all, the way light caught the lines of her jaw, the angle of her hand resting lightly against the arm of the chair, the calm command in the tilt of her chin. Mariam felt him in the same way, every careful motion, every shift in energy calculated and potent. It was in these almost imperceptible moments that the tension solidified. A brush of the sleeve, a glance that held just a fraction too long, the way their bodies seemed to measure distance instinctively, all spoke louder than words ever could. Gabriel recognized the game immediately. This woman was not merely present. She was a force, one that dared him to approach and warned him not to overstep, all at the same time. And he found himself drawn in, fascinated, even as his mind catalogued every detail, every possibility, every inch he could claim without breaking the unspoken rules. Mariam's thoughts were just as acute. She had encountered charm before, power before, but nothing like this. Nothing that stirred an equal measure of wariness and desire. The tension was intoxicating, a rhythm neither could escape. Her body responded before her mind could intervene, every nerve alert, every heartbeat synchronized to his subtle motions. She did not yield, she measured, she challenged, she teased, inch by calculated inch, and she could sense him doing the same. Even in silence, a dialogue existed. Micro-expressions, fleeting touches of proximity, the tilt of a shoulder, the pressure of a gaze. They spoke a language of anticipation, of promises that had not yet been made but were already binding. Gabriel's restraint was deliberate. He had no desire to rush, no need to spoil the slow burn of inevitability. Every careful movement, every inch he approached and withdrew heightened the gravity between them. The tension became almost a tangible thing, something that could be felt pressing against the skin, tightening the chest, quickening the pulse. Time stretched and bent, collapsing the room into a sphere where only they existed. Every glance, every micro-movement, every carefully measured distance between them was a negotiation of power and desire. And in that charged, invisible space, the first act of their encounter had already begun. By the end of the evening, nothing had been claimed, yet everything was charged. The air carried the weight of anticipation, a promise that could not be ignored. Every inch, every second, every subtle gesture built a foundation for something inevitable, a collision of desire, control, and surrender that neither could resist. The first tension had been established. The game was set, and both knew, with an almost predatory certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The air between Gabriel Major and Mariam Duke had already been charged once, yet tonight it carried a different flavor, a teasing, electric undercurrent that promised both mischief and desire. Where Act 1 had been about recognition and unspoken intensity, this moment was about testing boundaries. The playful tension stretched and tightened like a coiled wire, vibrating with the possibility of surrender and control. Gabriel moved through the room with a practiced ease, every step deliberate, yet every motion carried the weight of restrained intent. He was aware of her gaze, just slightly following his movements, the subtle shift of her posture, the quiet hum of anticipation that clung to her presence. The distance between them was measured not in meters but in the invisible inches that teased the body and mind alike. Each step forward, each tilt of his head, was an unspoken challenge. See how far she would let him go before she pulled back. Mariam, for her part, responded with a knowing awareness. She understood the language of inches. The brush of his sleeve across the back of her hand was no accident. The way he lingered just a fraction too long near her, letting a shoulder almost but not quite graze hers, it was deliberate and she recognized it immediately. And so she returned the favor, leaning slightly closer than necessary, tilting her chin in a way that dared him to reach further. Their movements were a careful choreography of desire, a game of push and pull played entirely without words. The space around them became a playground for the subtle, the suggestive, the intoxicating. Gabriel's presence seemed to stretch the very air, creating a magnetic field Mariam could not resist. He was conscious of every detail, the curve of her neck as she looked away, the delicate flex of her fingers, the way her gaze could cut like a blade and soothe like silk in the same instant. She, in turn, was equally aware of him, every inch of him commanding attention, every subtle shift in posture communicating intent. There was humor hidden in the tension, though neither would have called it that aloud. The playful teasing was a duel in which each knew the stakes were high. 1 inch forward, a subtle lean, a deliberate brush of fabric, and the other would respond, not with surrender but with an equally measured counter. The game was in the anticipation, the waiting, the near collision of bodies and wills. And every time Gabriel dared a step closer, Mariam's pulse betrayed the thrill he had always sought to elicit. Luxury here was measured in refinement, in nuance, in the deliberate control of space and movement. Not in objects or titles, but in the way one commanded attention simply by existing within it. Every inch of Mariam's presence, every fraction of a second she held his gaze, spoke of precision, intelligence, and a confidence that tempted him like a forbidden indulgence. Likewise, Gabriel's subtle dominance, the way he let her near without surrendering, made the air between them almost unbearable, thick with possibility. The teasing stretched on, playful yet charged, a slow build that promised eventual release. Every glance was a spark, every movement a promise, every small touch a declaration of intent. They understood the rhythm instinctively. This was not mere flirtation, but a slow, deliberate seduction measured in proximity, attention, and restraint. Even those around them could feel it, the almost palpable tension, though none could name it. Mariam's mind was alert, aware, savoring the game as much as the potential it held. Each near touch, each careful brush of hand against hand or shoulder against arm, was a wordless sentence in a conversation neither wished to end. She teased him as he teased her, inch by inch, testing limits, feeling the pulse of desire that had only begun to awaken the moment they had first acknowledged one another. Gabriel, in turn, responded to her cues with the precision of someone accustomed to control, yet he reveled in the challenge. Every hesitation she allowed, every subtle retreat, drew him in further. The tension between them was a tangible thing, pressing, magnetic, impossible to ignore. And yet, despite the near contact, the almost touching, nothing had been given entirely. Everything was suspended, hovering on the edge of inevitability. As the night deepened, the playful teasing carried them further along the same magnetic current that had bound them since the first glance. They moved through the space with a rhythm of inches, their bodies speaking a language of desire, defiance, and mutual recognition. Each subtle action, each measured movement, layered upon the last, constructing a complex lattice of anticipation that neither could resist. By the end of the evening, the playful tension had morphed into something deeper, something thicker, something impossible to ignore. The game was no longer simply play, it had become a slow burn of want, a fire lit inch by inch, and both of them could feel its inevitable draw. It was clear to both of them, though unspoken, that this night would not end without escalation. The inches had been measured, the provocations tested, the desire acknowledged in quiet, deliberate ways. And while neither had fully surrendered, both knew, without needing to speak, that the next step would demand everything they had been holding back. The room had grown quieter in their orbit, the background chatter fading into an almost irrelevant hum. Gabriel Major felt it before he recognized it, the kind of awareness that made the skin tingle, that sharpened every sense, every muscle, every instinct. Mariam Duke moved closer, not deliberately, or at least not in a way that seemed deliberate, but the subtle arc of her step, the tilt of her shoulder, brought them nearer than ever before. Proximity became a weapon, and both of them wielded it with exacting care. This was different from playful teasing. The stakes had shifted. Here, inches mattered more than seconds, and every slight movement carried weight. Gabriel's pulse quickened as he noticed the way the soft curve of her neck caught the light, how a strand of hair slipped past her ear in a way that invited attention. He did not touch her, not yet, but he inhaled the scent of her presence, sharp and intoxicating, a quiet assertion of her existence that demanded his full awareness. Mariam, for her part, felt the subtle draw of his nearness. Each step he took, each shift of his body, conveyed command and restraint simultaneously. Her senses were alight, every nerve tingling, and yet she held herself in check, savoring the electric tension that seemed to emanate from him. It was not a physical chase, not yet, but an unspoken recognition that the space between them was charged with possibility, and every millimeter closed carried both risk and promise. The air between them was no longer merely suggestive, it had substance. Each glance, each minute adjustment of posture, created a gravity that pressed lightly against the skin, whispering of things unspoken. Gabriel's hand hovered almost imperceptibly near the edge of the table, his awareness of her so acute that even the smallest shift, a lean forward, a subtle tilt, was registered instantly, processed with deliberate calculation. Mariam's body responded in equal measure, the brush of a shoulder against his arm as she adjusted her stance, the slight inhale when their gazes locked longer than propriety demanded. Luxury in this moment was not measured by possessions, but by the elegance of control, by the refinement of understanding, by the subtle command of presence. The way Gabriel held himself, aware of his own power, aware of the pull he exerted without a single word, the way Mariam matched that power with quiet precision, inch by deliberate inch. It was a conversation of bodies, a silent negotiation, and each participant understood the unspoken rules. Anticipation over indulgence, subtlety over force, desire over submission. They moved around each other like predators circling prey, though neither was prey entirely. It was a game of inches and awareness, a push and pull of proximity that had its own rhythm. The subtlest adjustments, a slight lean toward, a fraction of a step back, sent currents through the space that were almost tangible, almost audible in their intensity. It was as if the universe itself had contracted to a narrow plane defined by the tension between them. Mariam felt the pull of him as strongly as he felt the pull of her. Every nerve ending seemed to come alive, every sense heightened, attuned to even the tiniest shift. The brush of a fingertip against her wrist, whether intentional or incidental, made her pulse spike. The slight warmth emanating from his side drew her closer without her volition, a gravity she could neither resist nor ignore. And yet, she maintained her composure, letting the inches close just enough to inflame anticipation, but never enough to surrender completely. Gabriel recognized her mastery in return. Every movement was deliberate, a calculated provocation, a test of restraint. The closeness was intoxicating. Every inhalation of her scent, every near brush of fabric, every micro-expression was an indulgence and a challenge all at once. He felt himself responding, tension coiling and uncoiling with each heartbeat, knowing that the next step would demand absolute presence, absolute awareness, absolute control. In this charged sphere, the world beyond them ceased to exist. Conversations, movements, and distractions blurred, leaving only the gravity of their proximity. The closeness was not purely physical. It was a convergence of minds, bodies, and instincts. The electric charge of desire and recognition left both keenly aware of the inches that separated them, aware that the eventual collision was inevitable, and aware that restraint itself could become the sweetest form of torment. As the encounter lingered, the closeness became a force neither could escape. Every small gesture, every deliberate or accidental motion, magnified the intensity of what was building. The room, the evening, even the air around them conspired to hold them suspended in the exquisite tension of almost touching. By the end of this close encounter, the boundary between playful anticipation and urgent desire had thinned to a razor's edge. Neither had crossed it fully, yet neither could deny its pull. The first true intimacy, unspoken yet undeniable, had been forged inch by deliberate inch. Gabriel Major understood the language of dominance without needing words. Tonight it was not about proximity alone, it was about control, the subtle assertion of intent that left no room for mistake. Mariam Duke had never encountered someone who commanded a room through presence and nuance alone, and tonight she would discover that she was equally capable of responding in kind. The space between them was no longer measured merely in inches, it was a battlefield of desire, strategy, and unspoken rules. The evening had evolved into a deliberate dance of observation. Gabriel's eyes followed her with a precision that suggested both calculation and hunger. Every tilt of her head, every step she took, seemed to provoke him, and he allowed himself to respond, not impulsively but in measured increments. He leaned closer, let a shoulder brush lightly against hers, and then pulled back, watching her reaction with a predatory patience. Mariam caught it all, and with a single subtle adjustment of posture, of glance, she reminded him that she was not a passive participant. This was a challenge, an unspoken provocation that demanded recognition. Each movement, each almost touch, each lingering gaze, was a test of boundaries. Gabriel knew that to yield too soon would diminish the thrill, to resist too long might frustrate the inevitable. He thrived in this balance, in the tension of restraint that only deepened desire. Mariam, attuned to every nuance, mirrored him perfectly. Her responses were deliberate, controlled, and intoxicating. She allowed herself to lean into his space just enough to ignite tension, only to retreat a fraction of an inch, leaving him aware of the hunger she stirred. The room itself became an accomplice. The light softened around them, the shadows draping across surfaces in such a way that every motion seemed magnified. Gabriel noticed the subtle shift of her weight, the soft brush of her fingers against the edge of the table, and the quiet way she inhaled when he drew just a little closer. Each inch of contact, each fraction of space closed, became a dialogue of power, of surrender deferred, of anticipation heightened. Mariam's mind was alive with the thrill of the challenge. She recognized his tactics, understood the pull he exerted without needing words, and decided to meet it with equal force. Every step she took, every deliberate tilt of her body, every micro-expression became a calculated maneuver. She teased him inch by inch, daring him to act, daring him to claim, while keeping herself intact, untouchable yet undeniably present. Gabriel felt the full weight of her resistance and her provocation. Desire coiled in his chest, and he recognized that the thrill lay not in conquest alone but in the intelligence with which she defended herself. The more subtle her counter, the more intoxicating she became. The challenge was exquisite, a game played entirely through awareness and inch-perfect movements. There was no room for impatience, no place for misstep. The stakes were the electricity that pulsed between them, the almost tangible current of wanton power. Every brush of clothing, every fraction of a breath caught too close, was a weapon in their silent duel. He felt the heat radiating from her presence, the magnetic draw of her gaze, and he measured each response, each subtle retreat, each nearly submissive posture. It was a negotiation without words, a battle of wills expressed through inch-by-inch intimacy, each motion weighted with intent, each glance a challenge and a promise all at once. Luxury was defined in these moments not by objects but by precision, presence, and command. Gabriel's control was effortless, Mariam's resistance elegant, and together they constructed a world of tension so concentrated it was almost palpable. Every micro-movement, the brush of a hand, the tilt of a hip, the flicker of a look, built upon the last, creating a lattice of anticipation that neither could resist. The seductive challenge reached its peak in the subtle collisions of bodies, an arm brushing the small of a back, a hip nudging just close enough to feel warmth, a gaze that lingered in a way that felt deliberate. Both were acutely aware of the inches separating them, aware of the mutual pull that promised more than either dared claim outright. It was intoxicating, exhilarating, and completely consuming. By the end of the night, neither had yielded fully, yet both had been claimed in the most potent of ways. Their minds, their attention, their desire entwined in a silent contract written in inches. The game had been tested, rules had been established, and the tension hung heavy, electric, undeniable. Every movement, every glance, every measured step had escalated desire, proving that the real seduction was not in surrender, but in the slow, deliberate challenge that left both aching for the next inch, the next encounter, the inevitable collision of control and indulgence. The room seemed smaller now, as though it had contracted around Gabriel Major and Mariam Duke. The energy between them had matured, deepened, becoming more intimate yet charged with a silent fire. Every movement was deliberate, every inch a conversation unspoken but understood, and each glance carried the weight of anticipation. Nothing needed to be said aloud, words were a luxury they did not yet require. The promises lingered in the space between them, whispered by the heat of proximity and the quiet pull of desire. Gabriel observed her with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The curve of her neck, the slight shift of her weight, the delicate flex of her fingers, they all spoke volumes. He could feel the tension coiling inside him, measured, precise, waiting for acknowledgement. Mariam, sensing his scrutiny, let the subtle twitch of her lips betray the awareness of his attention. She was the kind of presence that demanded recognition, not by flamboyance or exaggeration, but through the careful orchestration of posture, gaze, and silent confidence. It was in the near touches that the whispered promises took form. A shoulder brushing lightly, a hand hovering near the small of a back, a fraction of a breath inhaled too close. They were all declarations of intent, subtle enough to intrigue but precise enough to maintain control. Each microgesture carried the weight of desire, calculated to evoke reaction, to tease, to hold the promise of fulfillment without yielding entirely. Mariam's mind was attuned to every nuance. She felt the tension pressing lightly against her skin, a quiet insistence that demanded acknowledgement. She mirrored his precision, responding with subtle cues of her own. A tilt forward, a lingering glance, a slight shift of the hip. Every inch of motion was deliberate, a challenge and an invitation wrapped into a single elegant dance. The unspoken promises were intoxicating, a current that pulsed invisibly, yet with undeniable strength, through every nerve ending. Gabriel felt the allure of her restraint as acutely as he felt the draw of her presence. It was a game, yes, but one that transcended triviality. The tension between them was not merely physical. It was cerebral, emotional, a slow burn that teased, coaxed, and demanded attention. The whispered promises were embedded in every glance, every measured step, every careful brush of limb against limb. Each nuance reinforced the magnetism, leaving both aware that their next encounter would carry the weight of this silent negotiation. The air around them seemed to thrum with expectation. Every detail, subtle movements of the body, careful positioning, even the quiet inhale when proximity edged too close, was charged with intent. Gabriel recognized the precision in Mariam's responses, the calculated nature of her near yielding. Each small motion was both a surrender and a provocation, a delicate balancing act that elevated the tension to near intolerable levels. Mariam's control was deliberate, almost artful. She allowed enough proximity to ignite desire but maintained the distance necessary to keep the power in her grasp. Every inch she yielded, every soft acknowledgement of his presence, whispered of what could come while withholding it entirely. She understood the intoxicating potency of anticipation, the magnetic effect of restraint, and she wielded it like a weapon honed for maximum effect. Gabriel in turn thrived on the challenge. The subtle cues she offered, the fractional inclines of her body toward him, the milliseconds her gaze lingered, these were the building blocks of the promises unspoken. Each gesture pulled him closer, yet the restraint itself intensified the allure. It was a seduction measured in inches, patience, and the quiet acknowledgement of mutual hunger. By the time the evening reached its quiet apex, the whispered promises had established themselves fully in the space they shared. The air between Gabriel and Mariam was thick with anticipation, the tension almost tactile. Every breath, every heartbeat, every measured inch of distance carried the weight of intention. Nothing had been claimed outright, yet everything had been acknowledged, and both knew that the next act, the inevitable escalation, would demand more than mere inches. It would demand surrender. The intimacy was subtle but unrelenting. Their thoughts, their attention, their very awareness of one another had become the foundation of desire. The whispered promises were no longer simply gestures. They were contracts written in the rhythm of proximity, the heat of nearly touching, the quiet insistence of recognition. By the end of the night, both Gabriel and Mariam understood that the allure of anticipation could be as potent, as addictive, as the fulfillment that would eventually follow. Every inch between them was a pledge, every subtle motion a declaration, every glance a vow. And as they parted for the moment, neither truly left. The promises lingered in the invisible threads that connected them, ensuring that the tension, the desire, and the inevitable surrender would not only return, they would demand it. The night held a different weight now, heavy with desire and the kind of danger that sharpened every sense. Gabriel Major felt it in the way the air seemed thicker around Mariam Duke, each movement she made carrying the allure of something forbidden, something that should be resisted but could not be denied. The tension between them had evolved beyond teasing. It had transformed into a magnetic pull, a challenge that teased not only the body but the mind, the morality, and the instinctual craving that simmered beneath control. Gabriel's awareness of her presence had become nearly unbearable. Every inch of proximity carried temptation. Every subtle glance spoke volumes, an unspoken challenge daring him to cross boundaries that reason might otherwise dictate. Mariam's elegance, her calculated restraint, made the temptation even more potent. She seemed to exist in a space both just within reach and frustratingly beyond it. The pull was irresistible because it felt illicit, like touching the edge of a world he wasn't supposed to enter but could not help wanting to explore. Mariam, for her part, recognized the forbidden nature of their encounter as acutely as he did. The electricity between them was no longer simple tension. It had evolved into a dangerous intimacy that promised satisfaction while threatening exposure. She felt it in the quickening of her pulse, the subtle flush along her skin, the way her breath caught when he moved closer than decorum might permit. Each near brush of body against body was a test, an acknowledgement of desire that should have been denied but wasn't. She allowed herself the thrill, letting the temptation stretch across inches, fueling her own hunger while maintaining the illusion of control. Every movement became a game of restraint and indulgence. Gabriel's calculated closeness, the faint brush of his hand along a surface just beyond her reach, the quiet magnetism of his presence, drew her in without touching. Mariam mirrored him, letting the allure linger, daring him to act, to test limits, to take what the tension promised but had yet to deliver. The forbidden nature of it all heightened every sensation, the pulse of her neck when his gaze lingered, the warmth that radiated from the near proximity of his shoulder, the subtle brush of his sleeve against her arm as he passed by. The temptation was intoxicating precisely because it was restrained. Each inch withheld, each near contact, was a promise amplified by what they could not give freely. Gabriel felt it in the subtle arch of her brow, the soft tightening of her jaw, the way she allowed herself to lean ever so slightly closer while maintaining the impression of independence. Every gesture spoke of desire restrained, longing tested, and the delicate tension of a collision waiting to happen. Mariam's mind was alive with the awareness of danger and thrill. Every motion he made, every subtle movement in her periphery, was a reminder that the temptation was deliberate, that the stakes were high, and that yielding would mean surrendering not just desire, but the carefully constructed boundaries she had maintained. Yet she could not deny the pull, the way her body and mind responded instinctively, inch by tantalizing inch. Gabriel thrived in this delicate dance of restraint. He understood that forbidden desire had its own power, that the pull of the unattainable was far more intoxicating than the easily claimed. He let the tension build, letting the inches shrink without breaking the rules, allowing Mariam to feel the magnetic draw, the silent challenge, the promise of indulgence if she chose, or if he chose, to cross the line. The environment seemed to conspire with them, the muted lighting, the quiet shadows, the soft hum of the night beyond the room all amplifying the intimacy. Each subtle movement, each carefully measured shift of posture, carried a weight heavier than words could convey. The temptation was both physical and psychological, a heady mixture that left both aware of the inevitability of escalation while savoring the deliciousness of delay. By the end of this encounter, both Gabriel and Mariam understood that the pull of the forbidden was not something easily resisted. The inches had been tested, the rules had been acknowledged, and yet the tension remained heavier than ever. Every glance, every micromotion, every heartbeat had served to heighten desire, to solidify the magnetic force drawing them together. The temptation was no longer abstract. It had become a tangible presence, inescapable, intoxicating, and entirely consuming. In that charged atmosphere, they existed in a private world built on inches, restraint, and craving. The forbidden nature of the encounter only sharpened the tension, ensuring that every movement, every gesture, every subtle exchange between them would continue to ignite desire and anticipation until the inevitable moment when restraint would finally be abandoned. Gabriel Major's restraint had limits, and tonight, those limits were being tested beyond endurance. The subtle games, the inches measured, the teasing anticipation, all had led to a single undeniable truth: he could wait no longer. Every nerve in his body screamed for action, every heartbeat a reminder that desire was no longer a question but a demand. Mariam Duke was near, dangerously near, and the space between them felt smaller by the second, electric with possibility and the promise of surrender. He did not reach for her recklessly. There was a precision in his movement, an inevitability in the way he closed the distance, that made the act itself a declaration of dominance and desire. Gabriel's hand hovered for a heartbeat near her arm, and Mariam felt it even before contact was made, the anticipation almost unbearable. The magnetic pull between them had condensed into a tangible force, pressing, guiding, and commanding acknowledgement. Every inch he claimed, she felt as a mixture of surrender and challenge, as if the very air conspired with him to collapse all restraint. Mariam's body responded instinctively, tension coiling and uncoiling with every subtle shift. She had anticipated this moment, had felt it building since their first encounter, yet the immediacy of his claim took her by surprise, not in its force but in the precision, in the deliberate, measured assertion that left no room for negotiation. Gabriel did not simply move. He announced his presence in every line of his body, in every glance, in the slight tightening of his jaw, in the way his hand traced along her arm just enough to evoke shivers but never overstep entirely. Every brush of fabric, every fraction of contact, was a language of power and consent, a silent understanding that desire was mutual yet tempered by control. Mariam felt it in the subtle heat that radiated from his hand, in the almost imperceptible press of his side closer to hers, in the magnetism that drew them together inch by inch. She could have resisted, yet the pull was irresistible, the claim too commanding to deny, and the intoxicating mixture of surrender and challenge left her shivering in anticipation. The room seemed to shrink around them, collapsing into a sphere defined entirely by proximity, desire, and unspoken acknowledgement. Gabriel's awareness of every detail, the curve of her neck, the slight parting of her lips, the arch of her brow, made the claim precise, measured, yet all-encompassing. Mariam responded not with words but with movement. A tilt closer, a subtle lean into the inches he occupied, a soft flex of muscle that conveyed awareness, acknowledgement, and an almost imperceptible invitation. Luxury in this encounter was not material, it was refinement, control, and understanding. The elegance of the moment, the precision of movements, the careful orchestration of near touch, all spoke of a mastery that elevated desire into art. Gabriel's claim was not brute force, it was a meticulous construction of anticipation, desire, and mutual recognition. Mariam's response, equally deliberate, mirrored the intensity, heightening the tension with every fraction of movement. They moved together in this dance, each aware of the silent dialogue between inches, of the push and pull that defined their interaction. Gabriel's hand found the small of her back, lingering with deliberate pressure, and Mariam responded with the slightest shift forward, acknowledging the claim without conceding control entirely. Each gesture, each micro-motion, was a promise realized in anticipation, a magnetic assertion of presence that left both intoxicated and yearning. The claim extended beyond the physical. It was cerebral, emotional, and instinctual. Gabriel's gaze held her, drew her in, and Mariam's awareness of being claimed heightened her own hunger, her own craving, her own awareness of the inevitability that desire demanded fulfillment. Every heartbeat, every measured inch, every subtle brush of proximity was a symphony of tension, orchestrated with precision and executed with undeniable force. By the end of the night, the claim had been made and acknowledged. Neither had fully surrendered, yet both were fully entangled in the magnetic pull of one another's presence. The tension was no longer a suggestion, it was a reality, a statement of desire and control that neither could ignore. Every inch, every gesture, every subtle acknowledgement had built a foundation for what was to come, leaving both Gabriel and Mariam aware that the next encounters would demand escalation, indulgence, and a surrender measured not in hesitation, but in absolute, deliberate action. The room had shifted once again, settling into a quieter, almost private intimacy. Gabriel Major and Mariam Duke existed in a sphere of their own making, a space defined not by walls but by the pull of desire, control, and acknowledgement. The claim had been made, but the revelation of it, what lay beneath the surface, was only beginning. In this space, every movement, every breath, every measured inch became a confession in itself. Gabriel's gaze lingered on her with an intensity that went beyond mere observation. He understood the language of presence, the subtle conveyance of thought and intent through posture, gesture, and the tiniest shifts of expression. Mariam felt it immediately, the weight of acknowledgement, the silent recognition that he saw more than the surface, that he had read the layers beneath her composed exterior. And she responded not with words, but with the tilt of her head, the fraction of a lean toward him, the way her hand hovered near his without touching. A declaration as powerful as any spoken vow. The confessions were not verbal. They were threaded through every micro-movement, every hesitation and approach, every subtle exchange of energy that had defined their connection from the beginning. Gabriel's hand brushed against her waist, lightly, deliberately, an inch of contact heavy with meaning. Mariam's pulse quickened, and in that quickening she confessed her own awareness, her own desire, her own readiness to be seen, understood, and engaged. Each inch of proximity was a word, each measured breath a sentence, each glance a paragraph in a story neither had spoken aloud. There was a refinement to the intimacy, an elegance to the confession, that elevated the moment beyond simple physicality. Gabriel's awareness of her reactions, every muscle that tensed, every subtle inhale, every tilt of her gaze, became the medium through which understanding and desire were exchanged. Mariam, in turn, responded with equal precision, allowing the space between them to speak of acknowledgement and anticipation. Each silent confession layered upon the last, building a private language that only they could understand. Luxury in this act was not in possession or display, but in attention, presence, and the deliberate pace of revelation. Every subtle brush of his hand, every almost touch of her arm, carried a weight far greater than words. They existed in a rhythm of confession measured in inches, heartbeats, and electric awareness. The intimacy was not hurried, it was cultivated, deliberate, and unrelenting in its impact. Mariam's awareness of Gabriel intensified with every shift, every subtle pressure, every near contact. She could feel the pull of him as acutely as she felt the pull of her own restraint, a tension that spoke of both desire and respect, both curiosity and knowledge. The confessions of intent, of craving, of unspoken promises, passed invisibly between them. Each inch claimed, each proximity tested, became a revelation, a mutual acknowledgement of what both had long desired but had not yet fully admitted. Gabriel's precision was intoxicating. The way he lingered in the space just near enough to feel her presence, the careful alignment of his posture, the subtle movements that suggested desire without imposing it, each action became a statement, a confession of control tempered by awareness of her power. Mariam, equally deliberate, allowed herself to be drawn into the rhythm, teasing and yielding in measured doses, heightening the tension without fully surrendering. The intimacy of the act was also a confession of trust. Every inch of proximity required awareness, consent, and acknowledgement of mutual boundaries. Neither had to speak to convey understanding. The space between them, charged with anticipation and desire, communicated everything necessary. Each movement, each subtle gesture, was both a question and an answer, a challenge and an admission, a testament to the careful balance of power and craving. By the end of this encounter, both Gabriel and Mariam had acknowledged the depth of their connection. The confessions, silent yet undeniable, had forged a bond that was both sensual and cerebral, charged with anticipation and heavy with potential. Every inch measured, every movement deliberate, every glance loaded with intent, had drawn them closer not only physically but emotionally, mentally, and instinctively. The act concluded not with surrender, but with the understanding that confession, like desire, was a slow, deliberate process. The space between them remained charged, a promise of what was to come, an acknowledgement of the intimacy that had already begun, and the inevitability of further indulgence. Every inch shared had become a testament, every gesture a private vow, and every heartbeat a confirmation of the desire that bound them. Mariam Duke moved with deliberate caution, each step calculated to maintain control, to uphold boundaries she was unwilling to abandon entirely. She had felt the pull of Gabriel Major from the first encounter, had measured it, played with it, allowed herself to be drawn closer inch by inch, but now instinct demanded a moment of distance. She needed space to breathe, to regain composure, to resist the magnetic claim he had over her. But Gabriel did not allow distance to persist. His awareness of her movements was uncanny, every micro-shift, every hesitation, every step she took recorded in his mind as both invitation and challenge. He mirrored her intent with precision, closing the gap without overt pursuit, turning the attempt to escape into a dance neither could fully control. The space between them remained charged, taut with tension, and Mariam could feel the inevitability pressing upon her as if the air itself conspired against her. Her retreat was slow, measured, every step a deliberate attempt to assert independence. Yet with each inch she gained, Gabriel closed the distance in subtle, imperceptible ways, a shoulder lightly brushing hers as he passed, a gaze that lingered too long, the faint warmth of his presence grazing her side. Each movement whispered, "You cannot escape what has already begun." And she knew it was true. Desire had been seated, tension had been acknowledged, and the pull between them was no longer optional, it was inevitable. Mariam's pulse raced with a mixture of thrill and apprehension. She had always prided herself on control, on restraint, on the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. But Gabriel's presence, the deliberate closeness, the way he occupied space with magnetic force, made her aware that control was an illusion. Every inch of proximity was a reminder of what she wanted but had not yet surrendered. Every subtle gesture from him, every careful alignment of posture, every unspoken promise, dissolved her resistance like water against stone. Gabriel understood the psychology of pursuit, the power of subtlety over overt force. He did not chase her recklessly. He claimed her in measured increments, inch by inch, pressure by pressure, anticipation by anticipation. Each near touch, each fraction of space closed, was designed to tease, to provoke, to make her aware that resistance was futile and surrender was not just desired, it was inevitable. The failed escape became a testament to the magnetic, almost predatory nature of desire he wielded with precision. Mariam felt the pull with every nerve, every breath, every heartbeat. The thrill of attempted resistance only heightened the sensual tension, making her acutely aware of the inches between them, the proximity that was simultaneously tormenting and intoxicating. Her body betrayed her as much as her mind. A subtle lean toward him, a fleeting brush of her hand, the slight inhale that betrayed anticipation, all unintentional confessions she could not fully suppress. The intimacy of their encounter was a battlefield of restraint and temptation. Gabriel's claim pressed against her subtly, intentionally, never reckless, always controlled, a careful negotiation of space and power. Mariam realized, even as she tried to step back, that her attempt to escape had failed before it had begun. Every movement was anticipated, every inch contested and reclaimed, and the inevitable conclusion loomed with unspoken certainty. Even the environment seemed complicit, the subtle shadows, the muted lighting, the quiet hum of the night amplifying every sensation. Each near collision of bodies, each deliberate alignment of gaze, each almost touch, carried with it the weight of unspoken promises and inevitable surrender. The escape had become irrelevant. The tension had solidified into something tangible, magnetic, and inescapable. By the end of the night, Mariam understood the truth. The pull of Gabriel Major was inescapable. She had tried, subtly, delicately, to preserve distance, to assert autonomy, but the very inches she attempted to claim as space were drawn back with precision, patience, and unyielding desire. The escape had failed, and with it she had surrendered, if not to action, then to awareness, anticipation, and the undeniable force of magnetic inch-by-inch intimacy that neither of them could deny. The failure of the escape did not diminish her power. Rather, it intensified it, transforming every inch of proximity into a charged, shared acknowledgement of desire. Gabriel's control and her submission, deliberate yet irresistible, created a tension so rich, so palpable, that both understood. The next encounter would not be about restraint. It would be about indulgence, intensity, and the ultimate surrender of every inch they had been holding back. The air between Gabriel Major and Mariam Duke was charged beyond anticipation, every inch of space between them now a battlefield conquered by desire, control, and mutual surrender. No words were necessary. The intensity of their shared understanding had transformed restraint into a prelude, teasing into inevitability. Every glance, every subtle movement, every measured approach had led to this, the culmination of tension built inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. Gabriel's presence pressed against her in ways both invisible and undeniable. His proximity was deliberate, his attention unwavering, and the weight of his intent was unmistakable. Mariam felt it radiate through her, a magnetic force she could no longer resist. The careful dance of teasing, the almost touching, the playful defiance, all of it coalesced into one undeniable reality. Every inch between them was about to be claimed, and every inch she had guarded was no longer hers to withhold. She surrendered, not in hesitation but in awareness. Each movement she made, every subtle lean, every fleeting touch of her hand against his, became an acknowledgement of desire, a tacit agreement that what had been denied inch by inch would now be claimed fully, with precision, intensity, and deliberate indulgence. Gabriel's hand traced the curve of her back, lingering with exacting control, and Mariam responded with a shiver that spoke of anticipation, excitement, and release. The claim that had begun subtly now expanded, encompassing every inch that had once been a space of tension, transforming it into a conduit for fulfillment. The elegance of their interaction was in its precision. Every inch taken was measured, every movement deliberate. Gabriel's control was absolute yet refined, commanding without overwhelming. Mariam's surrender was complete yet empowered, a conscious acknowledgement of the magnetic pull that had been irresistible from the very beginning. Their bodies spoke in the language of touch, of pressure, of alignment and proximity, each gesture a sentence, each glance a declaration of intent. The space between them dissolved entirely. What had been playful, teasing, forbidden, and restrained was now immediate, tangible, and all-consuming. Gabriel's hands, firm yet tender, guided, explored, and claimed. Mariam's responses, instinctive and deliberate, mirrored his intensity, amplifying the connection with every heartbeat. The inches that had been carefully measured and tested in previous acts were now wholly occupied, wholly surrendered, wholly celebrated. Every subtle motion became an affirmation. A tilt of the hip, a gentle press of shoulder against shoulder, a brush of fingertips along a spine, they were all declarations of desire, of fulfillment, of the culmination of every unspoken promise that had built through the tension, the teasing, and the restraint. In these moments time itself seemed to stretch, the world outside irrelevant, leaving only the magnetic, consuming, and absolute connection between them. Mariam's senses were overwhelmed by the precision of his touch and the depth of his intent. Every inch claimed, every movement deliberate, heightened the intimacy, fusing desire with awareness. The tension that had once been playful and teasing had been transformed into a symphony of sensation, desire, and surrender. Each motion resonated not only through her body but through her very awareness of the power, control, and passion that he wielded with such refined precision. Gabriel's mastery, refined and deliberate, allowed him to guide without coercion, to claim without domination, to fulfill without diminishing the intensity of anticipation. The culmination was more than physical, it was cerebral, emotional, and instinctual, a complete surrender of control, the fulfillment of every inch-long promise, the absolute acknowledgement of mutual desire. Mariam's surrender, measured yet absolute, reflected the depth of their connection and the power of desire cultivated inch by inch, act by act. As the climax of the night unfolded, every inch had been taken, every gesture amplified, and every heartbeat synchronized. The tension, anticipation, and temptation that had defined their encounters were realized fully, leaving both Gabriel and Mariam in a state of exquisite fulfillment. The intimacy they had nurtured, measured and tested through every act, had reached its apex, a testament to the power of restraint, desire, and deliberate, adult indulgence. By the end, nothing remained between them but acknowledgement, satisfaction, and the lingering echo of every unspoken promise, every controlled inch, every magnetic, irresistible motion. The story had reached its natural, intoxicating conclusion. Desire had been claimed, boundaries had been explored, and every inch of anticipation had been realized. Gabriel and Mariam had been measured, tested, teased, and now, fully claimed, existed in a space where every inch was owned, celebrated, and surrendered in perfect harmony.